Hi everyone, it is week 7, and that means really that we are nearly halfway through the course. So we're making progress, and I hope you sense the progress we're making as well. And along those lines, what I really want to say, and I'm going to refer to this at the end of the lecture, is uh, I'm really impressed by the discussion posts that people are submitting, and I'm really impressed by the journaling that all of you are doing, and I think a lot of you are really using these opportunities to explore your own views on a lot of the topics that we've covered. And that, to me, is particularly gratifying because the way I set up this course, it is called Foundations of Public Administration for a reason. The readings that we engage in are very foundational for the most part, but I also admit that we really just survey the readings. We really don't necessarily get into depth on a lot of topics, but my goal is really to use the readings that we have to prompt you to explore in a deeper way some of the particular subject matter that you're interested in, and that's really for your term paper, from a more practical standpoint, but it's also really to whet your appetite on what you're looking into and studying for the rest of your coursework. Hopefully these foundational readings are doing that. But I think we're making really great progress in terms of discussing these issues with each other, and it's a great group of people who are frankly exchanging ideas, and I appreciate the extent to which you're doing that. So let me just move into this week's discussion on the progressive era, and we'll talk about some readings some more. Okay, so what is this thing we call the progressive era? I mean, this is an era roughly, from 1890 to about 1920, and this was a time of great social and demographic change in the United States. And of course, it's identified as the progressive era only in retrospect. So historians always look backwards because that's what historians do when they label different eras. The Revolutionary Era, the Bronze Age, whatever. It's in retrospect. So in retrospect, we call this period the Progressive Era. And perhaps a lot of the people living through the era didn't realize they were part of the Progressive Era, although some, I think, were astute enough to realize they were living through this historic era. So I was trying to come up with a way to contextualize what I thought the progressive era was. And one of the ways I thought of doing that was by making reference to the films by the historian Ken Burns. And I think most of you are familiar with at least one or two of Ken Burns' films. And so I picked out some of his films that I thought help contextualize the progressive era. And the first one I refer to is his film The Civil War, which is arguably his most famous film that he produced in 1990. But so the Civil War period, if obviously looking at the years isn't part of the progressive era, but it really helps set up the progressive era because it's the Civil War is a watershed in America's history, straddling America's past and its future. And in a sense, I think, and I think a lot of other people think this too, that it really was a completion of the struggle for the Constitution. We talked about this, and we talked about what Stivers had to say about the founders, what Rohr had to say about the founders, what Spicer and Terry had to say about the founders, and really the Civil War in this kind of tragic way, with a war that killed many hundreds of thousands of people, sort of completed to that point a struggle for equality for slaves. Although it's unfair to say that equality was achieved by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. It really wasn't. But that was an important moment for sort of filling out the Constitution. So the Civil War is this watershed in American history. And then I refer to Ken Burns' film The West that he produced in 1996. So what do we see here? You know, we that film talks about westward expansion, settlement, the railroad. It talks about homesteading, and ultimately the final defeat of, or what some people would call the genocide of, the native nations. And this essentially ended with the Battle of Wounded Knee in 1890. And so what we're seeing here is this settled nation from coast to coast. And it's this settled nation that is linked by a railroad, that is growing industrially, and it's growing in wealth. And so this kind of helps set up a reaction to a lot of this that we find happening in the progressive era. The next film of his I refer to is the film Prohibition. And so people think of Prohibition as this religiously inspired movement to cleanse the nation of alcoholism. But I mean, what people have to remember was that there actually was an alcoholism epidemic in the United States. The consumption of alcohol in the 1800s was actually far higher than it is today in the United States per person, and it was essentially out of control. And Prohibition was a reaction to that, it's true, and it was led by religious movements. But you know, the other linkage in Prohibition is that many of the people, particularly many of the women involved in the Prohibition movement, were also connected to movements for women's rights and women's suffrage. So it's kind of a confusing, contradictory time. And then I refer to Burns and the National Parks film. You know, the move to preserve some of America's natural treasures, if you will, was really pushed by Theodore Roosevelt, who considered himself a progressive. And, you know, this actually was occurring during the progressive era, really the founding of the national park system. Then I refer to his film Baseball, where he talks about, you know, really in the early years, in the early 1900s, America finds this pastime that unites its classes, at least for those fleeting moments that they are in a baseball park watching a game. I refer to his film The Roosevelts, which was a recent one, where really he connects the strident and what Theodore Roosevelt called, you know, his manly progressivism of Theodore Roosevelt to his distant relative and patrician reformer Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And then finally I refer to his film Jazz, where again, during the progressive era, America finds a music, its own music really, its own music voice, that at least in fleeting moments spans racial divisions. So I think, you know, referring to Ken Burns is maybe a little tenuous, but I think it's an interesting way to refer to the progressive era. So this thing we call the progressive era really was not one thing. It is partially, when we look back in retrospect, it's partially focused on individuals like Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson at the national level. People who probably considered themselves to be progressives. But it's kind of contradictory in a lot of ways too, because, for example, you know, during this era we see the Spanish-American War in 1898, and we know that Theodore Roosevelt greatly wanted to expand, you know, what turns out to be the imperial reach of the United States, and the Spanish-American War ends up with the colonial annexation of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines in around 1898. It ends up with the construction of the Panama Canal over that first decade of the 1900s. And so we have those things under Roosevelt, but we also have the first national park, as I alluded to, in 1906. We have the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was considered by businesses at the time as being very anti-business. In Roosevelt's drive to break up what were called trusts or very large monopolies in industries. Um, and then the United States enters the Great War in 1917, or World War One, over really the efforts of Woodrow Wilson to avoid doing that. But at the end of that, Wilson proposes this really forward-looking innovation called the League of Nations. But ironically, the United States never becomes a part of the League of Nations because the Senate refuses to ratify that treaty. And in 1920, Warren Harding is elected on his campaign pledge, of a return to normalcy. That was what Warren Harding campaigned on. And so what did he mean by that? What he meant was that, hey, we've had enough of all this frenetic progressive action. Let's just get back to normal. And let's kind of slow down a little bit. So we can refer to the progressive era by making reference to personalities, big personalities. But, we can also refer to the progressive era by focusing on some of these reactions against the established order. So in agriculture, and most of America was involved in agriculture in the 1800s, there was this thing called the Grange movement, and there were other movements in the late 1800s where farmers, small farmers, which really describes the practice of farming in the 1800s, formed something like a union to express grievances they had against the banking and railroad industries. In 1906, Sinclair Lewis wrote this famous novel called The Jungle about the abuses and degradation of work in the packing industry, which really led to great reforms in that particular industry. But during that time, there was a movement by workers for, who worked in mines and industry to strive for workers' safety and rights. I referred to the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League advocating sobriety, and that did result in the passage of the 18th Amendment in 1919. And not by accident. It was a very deliberate way of getting people elected in the House of Representatives and the Senate who would assure a majority to be able to pass that amendment in the Congress so that it could go on to the states for passage. But we also see things like the rise of socialists like Eugene Debs, who protested U.S. involvement in the Great War and ended up in prison for it. We see the rise of African American intellectual movements led by people like W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, who were at odds with each other, but who both were leaders of this nascent African American intellectual movement, only about 50 years post-slavery. So that's another aspect of the progressive era. And then, finally, the progressive era was focused on ideas. So, and the idea that we should break up industrial and financial control of monopolies in the railroad industries, the steel and oil and the banking industries. Roosevelt was very much in favor of that, as I said. The idea that we should respond to the oppression of poverty in urban centers through social action. The idea that we should support, and in some ways, some people thought maybe take advantage of immigrant populations. So between 1870 and 1930, a very large percentage, relatively speaking, of the population was foreign-born. So between 11 to 15% in all those censuses during that 50-year period were foreign-born, and that peaked out in about 1910. About 15% of the population was foreign-born, and by comparison, it was about 13% in 2010. So really what we see in these social movements in a lot of cases are people like Jane Addams, for example, in Chicago, who are trying to somehow bring a life of dignity to the primarily immigrant populations who were working in some of these factories under poor conditions. And so immigration was part and parcel of what was going on in the progressive movement. And then we see a response to the corruption of machine politics, what are called machine politics. The classic example of Chicago being a machine city, but it certainly wasn't the only machine politics city in the United States. New York, Kansas City, Omaha was are examples of cities where a political machine was running the city. And then striving for efficiency in government, especially at the local level. And we see this as a legacy of the progressive era. So, in summary, the progressive era is really not just one thing. It's really sometimes a confusing array of a lot of different ideas, often contradictory to each other, that in retrospect we look back on and say, yes, it was progressive, and yes, it did actually change the United States in many ways during those several decades. So I assigned you 3 readings this week, and what I want to do over the next 3 slides is just show you some questions that I think you ought to consider as you read these things. These are not our discussion questions, by the way, but these are just some questions that I think it would be good to consider as you read these readings. So when you read Cam Stiver's book, Bureau Men and Settlement Women, what do you think of? So this paper is a shorter version of a book she wrote, which if you have a chance you should read. So what was the Settlement House movement? What was this thing called the Municipal Bureau movement? And what's her contention about how these movements formed the foundational basis for the study of public administration? And what were some of the outcomes of these 2 movements she identifies? The Settlement House movement and the Bureau movement. How do we view efficiency in government? How do we view government's responsibility for social action? And how did government and nonprofit end up picking up parts of these missions as we move further down the road? So take a look at Stiver's work in that light. And she has many other things to say too that you should be picking up on as well. And then I have you look at this work by Savara, the structural reform impulse in local government. So what is Savara talking about here? He's talking about how we charter a city. So a city charter is a city constitution. So how did the progressive era influence the chartering of cities? So what were some of the observed problems leading to what he identifies as structural innovations starting after about 1890? How was structure reform used to correct problems? And what kinds of organizations were involved in these reforms? And then really, how do these reforms resemble this idea of making government run like a business? We still hear that term, right? I'm going to run for city council because I want government to be run like a business. Well, where did that come from? In part, it comes from what Savara is talking about. And what later problems with the reforms were observed and how were these corrected? And then how do reform cities with unitary governments, so what we call a reform city or a council manager city, how do they fit into our concept of separation of powers that we talked about? And then finally, how do reform cities fit in with our concept of the politics administration dichotomy? Those are things to think about as you read Savara. And then finally, I have you read this work by Williams, maybe not as famous a piece of literature, but I think it's interesting because what Williams talks about is this idea that we're measuring government. We're applying performance measure standards to government. Well, this really came from the progressive era. So how did this thing called the New York Bureau of Municipal Research begin to emphasize measurement? How are the founders of this bureau, which he talks about, how are they linked to both scientific management, Frederick Taylor, which we discussed, and the social movements of Jane Addams in Chicago and others? So Does the measurement movement show some kind of distrust of the electorate? And how is that so? Um, how does this movement affect the activity of budgeting in government? How does it affect the activity of human resources management in government? How does it affect our views about accountability in government? And really, so what are the practical purposes of measurement, performance measurement in government? And so how does this compare to more recent movements like New Public Management or Reinventing Government from the 1990s? How does what Williams is talking about in, from the progressive era compare to more modern movements? So, so with all that said, really, I again have a lot of confidence in all of you for the things you're writing in discussion posts and in journals, and I'm really super pleased with it. So I think it's incumbent on me really to allow your creativity to flow a little bit when I ask these discussion questions and kind of be open-ended. So based on what you read this week and any other sources you're familiar with, and also based on your own experiences or experiences of others that you know about, I want you to write to this question during the discussion this week. And it's the same kind of discussion. I'd like you to submit your discussion by Tuesday night, and then pose a critique or a question to classmates by Thursday night, and then by Saturday night respond to at least one of those. But how does the progressive era intellectually inform the modern study and practice of public administration? We haven't got to the end of the course, so I don't expect that you know everything about everything, and you're not going to anyway, but from what you know, how does this era, the progressive era, intellectually inform the modern study and practice of public administration? So that does end this week's lecture. I am again looking forward to seeing a lively discussion this week. I really greatly enjoy it. So keep up the good work there. Thank you.